The nutrient paste was gray, not the dull, forgivable gray of overcooked oatmeal or a winter sky. It was the gray of something that had never once, in its entire existence, tried to be anything other than fuel. I stood at the end of the long table and watched 42 alien children eat it without complaint, and something in my chest cracked open like an old wound. I had not cried in 6 weeks, not since I arrived on Velcara Station, not since I signed the volunteer forms, packed one bag, and walked out of an apartment that still smelled like Elena's shampoo. I was not here because I was brave, or noble, or built for hardship. I was here because my grief counselor said find purpose outside yourself, and I had absolutely run out of better ideas. My name is Marcus Delgado. I used to run a restaurant in Portland, Oregon. It had 14 tables, a wine list I was quietly proud of, and a head chef who happened to be my wife. When Elena died, I shut the doors, sold the equipment, and gave the recipes to her sister. Then I found a posting on the Interstellar Aid Corps website that said experienced food service workers needed, remote deployment, non-combat, and I thought, fine. Take me somewhere I have never been, so I can stop looking at everything she ever touched. They sent me to a bombed-out transit station orbiting a dead moon, staffed by 4 exhausted alien aid workers, and hosting 42 Vethkai children with no parents, no home, and no idea what was going to happen to them next. The Vethkai were a species I had never heard of before the deployment briefing. They had 4 arms, wide amber eyes that did not blink in any rhythm I could predict, and bioluminescent skin that pulsed softly when they felt something strongly. Joy made them glow gold. Fear made them go dim and blue. The youngest ones barely reached my hip. The oldest, a boy the others called Ren, was maybe 12 in human years, though their biology did not map perfectly onto ours, and I was guessing. They had been at this station for 3 weeks when I arrived. Their colony ship had been destroyed in a border conflict no major news outlet had covered. The station was supposed to be a waypoint. It had become something much longer, and nobody had updated the food supplies to match. The regular resupply ship was 17 days late. I counted the children every morning, not because anyone asked me to. I just needed to know the number was still the same. 42. Every morning, 42. What I noticed on my 3rd day, after the exhaustion of arrival had worn off enough to let me actually look, was that their bioluminescence was almost gone. Not the cool blue of fear exactly. Something worse. Something like absence. Like 42 small lights someone had forgotten to plug in. They were eating the paste. They were sleeping. They were alive. But they were not glowing, and I learned quickly enough that a Vethkai who is not glowing at all is a Vethkai who has stopped expecting anything good. I found the kitchen at the back of the station's lower deck. Calling it a kitchen was generous. It had 3 working burners, a fabricator unit that wheezed and groaned with every cycle, half a refrigeration compartment, and storage racks holding emergency rations, a few boxes of unidentified dry goods that had been there long enough to have no legible labels, and a single crate of something the manifest listed only as local root produce, origin unknown. I looked at all of it for about 4 minutes. Then I started cooking. I did not know what Vethkai children were supposed to eat. The biology notes in the station database were 11 pages long and included 1 paragraph on nutrition, which told me they were omnivorous, could process most carbon-based organic matter, and had a particular metabolic need for what the document called complex aromatic compounds, which was a scientific way of saying they needed food that smelled like something. The paste did not smell like anything. I pressure-cooked the root vegetables until they gave up fighting me and turned soft. I ground some of the dry goods, which turned out to be a grain similar enough to millet that I could work with it, and I made a kind of porridge with a texture that was at least better than paste. I found a sealed container of what I was fairly sure was a legume, soaked them overnight in water with a little of the station's powdered nutrient supplement, to make sure I was not accidentally poisoning anyone, and the next morning, I made small dumplings, folding each one by hand, because the fabricator kept making them come out lopsided, and I have always been particular about dumplings. I put everything out on the long table in small dishes, tasting portions, dozens of tiny plates. It looked, I thought, completely absurd in the middle of a transit station on a dead moon. The smallest child approached first. The others called her Siv. She was maybe 5 or 6. She had a small scar on her left upper arm that looked old and healed. She walked up to the table and looked at all the dishes very carefully, sniffing each one with her wide flat nose, moving slowly down the row. She picked up one of the dumplings. She smelled it for a long moment. Then she put the whole thing in her mouth. Her skin lit up gold. I sat down on the floor because my legs stopped working. By the time I stood up again, 8 other children were at the table, and they were glowing too, softly, in warm flickering patches. Ren stood at the far end with his arms crossed, watching, and when I met his eyes he looked away quickly. But his skin had a faint shimmer that had not been there before. I cooked every meal from that point on, 3 times a day. I traded cans of station coffee to a passing freighter pilot for a bag of something that turned out to be close enough to dried mushrooms that I could use it as a protein base. I bartered 2 of my personal meal rations for a small jar of something a Vethkai aid worker named Ul told me was a fermented flavoring paste her people used in cooking, salty and sharp and deeply aromatic. I used it carefully because I only had the 1 jar. The station had no dining schedule. I invented one. Breakfast at what passed for morning in the station's artificial light cycle, midday something warm and filling, evening the biggest meal, the one I spent the most time on. I started picking up words. Su meant good. Vel meant more. Ren taught me those first, grudgingly, while he helped me carry grain sacks because I had asked if anyone wanted to help, and he was the only one who stood up, and he acted like he had not meant to. I taught him how to tell when dumplings were cooked through, by how they felt when you pressed them lightly with a fingertip. He did not say anything, but the next day he came back and showed me he remembered. On the 9th day, I made a slow braised dish from the legumes with the fermented paste, and some of the root vegetables caramelized, until they were almost sweet, served over the grain porridge, with a little of the precious cooking fat I had found sealed in a tin at the very back of the storage rack. I had been saving it. I did not know what I had been saving it for, but that evening felt right. I put a bowl in front of Ren. He was quiet. He looked at it. He picked up the spoon, which I had taught him to use because Vethkai traditionally used their lower 2 hands together as a kind of scoop, and he tasted it. He said one word very quietly, Marath. I did not know what it meant. I asked Ul the next morning. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. She said it meant like home. I went back to the kitchen and stood there with the exhaust fan running for a while. I was not going to describe exactly what happened in those minutes. Some things are private. But I will say that when I came back out, I started planning the evening meal immediately, because that was the only thing I could think of to do with the feeling. Siv had taken to following me everywhere. All 4 of her arms would be full of various kitchen utensils she had decided were important. She handed them to me with great seriousness whether or not I needed them. I started saying thank you in Vethkai, and she would glow gold for about 30 seconds every time. The children were bright again. Not just at meals, all day. They were playing in the corridor outside their quarters. Ren had taught the younger ones a game with pebbles, and an elaborate set of rules that seemed to change every time I walked past. But all 42 of them were involved and shouting, which was, I had come to understand, a very good sign. I was not okay. I was not healed. Elena was still gone, and the restaurant was still dark, and the apartment I would go back to someday still smelled like her shampoo in my memory, in a way that made it almost impossible to think about. But I was functional. I was needed. I was feeding 42 children who were glowing again, and for right now that was enough to keep me moving. Then the ship arrived. Every piece of electronics on the station snapped and reset at once. The lights flickered. The fabricator shut down mid-cycle. The station commander, a Vethkai man named Soro who had barely slept in 3 weeks, came sprinting down the main corridor, looking like someone had told him something impossible. The ship in orbit was not the supply freighter. It was not any kind of vessel that regularly visited transit stations. It was the Velthai Sovereign, the royal flagship of the Vethkai matriarchy, and it was so large that it showed up on the station's visual sensors as a second moon. Queen Evelsan was coming aboard in 17 hours to personally assess the welfare of the orphaned children. Soro pulled me aside and said, in a very controlled voice, that this had never happened before in the recorded history of the Vethkai matriarchy. Queens did not board refugee processing stations. This was not a thing that existed in any protocol document. He had 17 hours to figure out how to receive a ruling monarch, and he was looking at me like I had answers. I said I would make dinner. He stared at me. I said the queen was coming to see if these children were all right. The best way to show her they were all right was to show her exactly what their days had looked like. I was going to make the same food I always made, and I was going to make enough of it. I did not sleep that night. I went through every ingredient I had, every favor I could call in from the freighter contacts I had built up over 2 weeks of small trades. I sent a message to a cargo pilot named Owen, who owed me a bag of real coffee, and I asked him to bring me anything fresh he could get his hands on within 12 hours. He came through with a net of something like firm plums and a wrapped package of dried herbs that smelled so strongly of rosemary and something citrus sharp that I held the package to my face and breathed for a moment before I put it down and got to work. I made the porridge Siv loved, thick and slightly sweet, portioned into 42 small bowls and one larger one. I made Ren's braised dish properly this time, with the herbs and real careful timing, and the good fat used without rationing. I made dumplings, every single one by hand, folded in the way I had taught Ren to check with a fingertip press. I made a soup from the plum-like fruit, reduced down with the fermented paste into something rich, and a little sour that smelled incredible, and I had no name for, but that felt right. 42 plates for 42 children, and a 43rd set slightly apart at the head of the table, with a card I had asked Uhl to help me write in Vethkai script. It said, "For the one who came to check." Queen Evilsan was 2.5 meters tall, and her bioluminescence did not pulse like the children's. It radiated. A deep, constant violet that made the air around her feel different in a way I could not explain physically but felt immediately in my sternum. She had an honor guard of 12 warriors, who moved with the controlled stillness of people trained not to react to anything, and a diplomatic entourage that filled the station corridor behind her. She looked at the station, she looked at Soro, who had rehearsed his greeting 40 times and delivered it at a pitch slightly higher than his normal voice. She looked at the assembled staff. Then Siv broke out of the line of children and ran directly to the queen and grabbed 2 of her hands with her own 4 arms. The honor guard took one collective step forward. The queen raised a single finger and they stopped. Siv was pulling her toward the table, chattering in Vethkai so fast my translation chip gave up and displayed a small question mark instead of a translation. The queen let herself be led. She walked the length of the table slowly. She looked at each of the 42 individual plates. She looked at the 43rd, set apart, with the card. She read it. She sat down. Nobody else moved. Nobody in her entire entourage made a sound. The honor guard looked like 12 statues in very serious armor. She picked up the spoon I had placed beside the bowl, the way I had shown Ren, and he had passed on to the younger children, and she tasted the braised dish. The silence was so complete I could hear the station's ventilation hum. After a moment she said, in standard, clearly and without accent, "Who made this?" Siv pointed at me with all 4 arms simultaneously. The queen looked at me. I was standing in the kitchen doorway in a stained apron holding a ladle. I had flour on my left sleeve and a small burn on my right wrist from the 3rd hour of the night before. I was 44 years old, and I had not had a full night of sleep since Elena died, and I am quite sure I looked like exactly what I was. She said, "Your species has a word. I was told it once, years ago, by a human diplomat who was trying to explain something untranslatable. The word is Marath." My throat closed. She said, "It does not mean a place. My people have never used it for a place. It is a feeling. It is what you carry inside you that tells you you are where you belong, with people who know you, eating something made by hands that love you." She looked at the children, who were glowing warm and gold around the table. All 42 of them. These children have been using that word about this station for 2 weeks. I could not understand it from the reports. I came to see for myself. Now I understand. I did not say anything. I was not capable of saying anything. Ren, across the table, looked at me. He was glowing the brightest I had ever seen him glow. He gave me a small, slow nod, the way I had seen him nod when something was exactly right. The queen stayed for 3 days. She ate every meal. On the 2nd day, her attendants began bringing ingredients from the flagship stores, Vethkai foods I had never seen, and the queen or her staff would sit in my kitchen doorway and explain what they were. It became a collaboration. I showed them techniques. They showed me flavors I had no framework for. A warrior from the honor guard named Galvin, who was enormous and carried a weapon I did not want to think about, turned out to be deeply interested in the process of making dumpling dough, and spent an entire afternoon learning it very badly, with enormous enthusiasm. On the third morning, before anyone else was awake, the queen found me in the kitchen. She said, "The children told me you cry sometimes, when you think they cannot hear." I said, "I lost someone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Vethkai believe that grief which turns outward, grief that feeds and tends, and keeps others warm instead of consuming only the one who carries it, is the most sacred form of love. You did not have to come here. You did not have to care what they ate. You cooked for 42 children who were not your kind, on a station that was not your home, with ingredients that were not your tradition, and you fed them back to themselves. That is not a small thing. In my culture, that is not ordinary. That is something we have a very old word for, and that word is not one I will translate for you, because some things need to be felt before they can be named." She paused. She said, "I am sorry for the person you lost." I handed her a bowl of morning porridge because it was the only honest thing I had. She took it. She sat at the table. Her skin went warm amber, slow and deep, like sunlight through water. She ate in silence, and I cooked beside her without speaking, and outside in the corridor, we could both hear the children waking up, and the sound of Ren's pebble game starting again, all 42 voices mixing together, getting louder. 8 months later I got a message from the Interstellar Aid Corps that the Vethkai Matriarchy had formally submitted a proposal to the interstellar community to establish human culinary volunteers as a recognized category of humanitarian aid workers. The proposal had passed. They were calling the program by a Vethkai name that translated roughly, and imperfectly, as those who make the light come back. I read the message sitting at the table in the new kitchen. The station had been rebuilt, real equipment, a proper cooler, spice racks that were actually full. Ren was beside me, watching the pot on the stove with the focused expression he had whenever he was learning something he did not want to admit he cared about. I was teaching him Elena's slow-braised stew, her recipe, the one I had not made for anyone since she died, because every time I thought about making it, I could not figure out how to start. He got it wrong the first 2 times. On the third try, he adjusted the heat without me telling him, and let it go low and slow, and when we tasted it, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marath." He said it without thinking, the way you say a word when it is the only true one. His skin was so bright I had to look away. I told him what Elena always said, that you cannot lie with a meal you made by hand, that either you cared or you did not, and the food always knew. He wrote it down in Vethkai script in the small notebook he carried. He said it translated perfectly. I think she would have liked that. I think she would have liked all of it. The kitchen, the children, the 42 small lights she never got to see, and the fact that even at the end of the worst year of my life, her recipe still tasted like coming home.